small block Ford, but what intake do you choose? Which one makes the most peak power? Which one makes the most peak torque? Which one makes the most average power? Is it a single plane? Is it a dual plane? Is it a dual plane with spacers? Let's find out. In this video, I have two comparisons. First one on a 302 Ford. We're going to compare a single plane funnel web intake to a dual plane eliminator intake. In addition to that, we're also going to try the dual plane with carb spacers, both an open spacer and a 4-hole spacer. Now, test number 2. On a larger 347, we're going to compare the funnel web to the dual plane to another single plane, Victor Jr. So how do they do? Let's find out. We're going to start off by taking a look at a comparison between a dual plane eliminator intake from Speedmaster and a funnel web intake, and it's also sold by the guys from Speedmaster. The funnel web obviously is a single plane, and the eliminator is a dual plane. Looks kind of like an RPM air gap style. And we also ran a few different spacers. Now this was the same motor that I ran in the video that I posted earlier today on nitrous. If you haven't seen that video, it's right here, where we compared the 302 to a 305, kind of a 5-liter shootout, both nitrous, basically just to show you what nitrous does, and then it does the same thing regardless of what kind of combination that you're putting it on. But this was the same motor. It was an Explorer, 5-liter Explorer short block, and we augmented it with that trick flow stage 2 cam. I'll go ahead and put the specs back up here for the guys that haven't seen it, but it's a mid 500 lift, 224, 232, and 112. So that's a cam that works really good on a 302, especially a street driver. Now we also equipped this thing with TFS 11R heads, which are really good, especially for this kind of combination. They work very well, make good power. And to get things started, after we installed the MSD distributor and hooker long tube 1.75" headers, we first put this thing on with the dual plane eliminator intake. And it was a 650 or 750 Holly, I think. It worked really well. And with this combination and the dual plane intake, this thing produced 394 horsepower and 370 foot-pounds of torque. I'm going to go ahead and check that. I want to go ahead and check that carburetor for you guys. Yeah, 650. So this is the combination with the dual plane intake, and it worked very well. As you can see, it's got a good torque curve, makes good torque down there in the 4,000 RPM range, and the peak power is pretty good. We ran this thing all the way up to 6,500. But here's what happened when we installed a couple of Wilson spacers. First thing we installed was an open spacer, a 1/2-inch open spacer, and it picked power up quite a bit. It was interesting that we picked up this much power with a spacer. It just goes to show you this kind of thing is not absolute. It's not we always pick up power from a spacer. Sometimes we do and sometimes we don't. Usually the dual plane is a bit more responsive, because when you add an open spacer like that, you're kind of changing what's going on with the intake manifold. Now both sides of the engine are communicating through that spacer. It's not divided anymore. And if we take a look here, the spacer picked up power from 4,500 all the way out to past 6,500. Below that, it actually lost power. So this is kind of the typical single plane dual thing, because that's what you're doing with the open spacer, is you're making the dual plane kind of act more like a single plane. But it picked peak power up to 402 horsepower. Peak torque was actually not really changed dramatically in terms of the peak, 370 foot-pounds of torque. So we were basically, it made the same. It just moved it out. It just did a little bit at a little bit higher RPM. So now let's take a look and see what happened when we installed a 4-hole spacer. So the 4-hole spacer, it did not respond as well to the 4-hole spacer. It still picked up power from about 5,100 on up, and with a 4-hole spacer, the combination produced 399 horsepower. So up there, kind of splitting hairs, and it did not lose out the way that the open spacer did down, because it still had the same kind of signal, because you were individualizing the bores there with the 4-hole spacer, which is kind of cool. But it just goes to show you the right kind of spacer on a particular application obviously can have a dramatic change in the power curve. And that little open spacer actually worked really well. And if I was running it at the track, that's what I would do. I would take the spacer with me, put the spacer on, and run it at the track, because you're running from 4,500 to 6,500 after you launch the car. Then you can take advantage of all that extra power, which would be cool. So now let's take a look and see what happened when we installed the funnel web on this thing. which is a single plane intake. So the funnel web made a lot more peak power, and made peak power compared to even the best open spacer there from 5500 on up, and compared to just the dual plane by itself from about 5200 up. Equipped with the funnel web, it made 415 horsepower, and obviously the gains would continue to carry out there. But take a look down here. I mean, this is the purple. We're talking about a loss of going from 370 foot-pounds down to 323 foot-pounds. So you're talking about a loss of 47 foot-pounds of torque. And that's the thing. That's the single plane, dual plane thing. You always lose a ton of power, or you lose some power down low, and you trade that for the gains that you get at the top. So again, is it worth it? What do you guys think? Do you think that the dual plane with the spacer might be a good, like, intermediate piece, especially something that you could throw on at the track if you were doing some drag strip runs? I don't know. That's up to you guys. Let me know what you think. After running our comparison on the smaller 302, we stepped up actually to a 347, and in all honesty, that funnel web intake might be better suited to something with more displacement like the 347, or where you're going to run lots of RPM, 6,500 plus RPM. It's a single plane design. It wants to make peak power pretty far out there. It flows really well. It's a high rise kind of deal. The funnel web works fairly well, and we'll see now. We're going to compare it to both a Victor Jr. and an RPM air gap, but on a 347. So this 347 was a stroker short block, a 4030 bore, 3.4 inch stroke. It had a flat top piston with dual valve reliefs on it, and we topped it with a set of Pro Max 210 CNC heads. It also had a fairly healthy camshaft in it, kind of my go-to stroker cam for a 347. It's the Comp XFI 236 cam. And I'll go ahead and put the specs up here, but it's a really good cam for kind of a street-oriented 347. Now they make one step above that for if you're going to go with like maybe a 408 or 392, 351 Windsor-based stroker. That's another step up in camshaft, although even the smaller one works really well. So we had that cam, had the Pro Max 210 CNC heads, which flow well and are more than able to support the kind of power level that we're at. And actually, we had the 1 3/4 headers, MSD distributor, and we had a 950 XP carburetor on here that worked really well. More than enough airflow from the carburetor to support this power level. We first ran it with an Edelbrock RPM air gap, the dual plane intake, and run with that dual plane. It produced 434 horsepower. Torque was pretty good, 412 foot-pounds of torque. So now let's take a look and see what happened when we replaced the dual plane RPM air gap with the single plane Victor Jr. And as we've come to expect, we did pick up a little bit of power at the top, although interestingly enough, we didn't pick up a ton. Normally we would see bigger gains in this, but it made 441 horsepower at the peak. The single plane made more power from 4,900 out past 6,500. Below that, we saw some fairly big torque losses. At 3,700, the torque went from 396 down to 364 foot-pounds. So it's a fairly big loss in torque, and that's typically what we see in the dual plane, single plane trade-off. More power up top for the single plane, less power down low compared to the dual plane. The dual plane is really kind of hard to beat for a 6,000 or 6,500 RPM kind of a street motor. It works fairly well, and even though it gave up a little bit at the top, I think I'd rather have the combination where we had a bunch more down low. But now here's the question, how well does the funnel web compare to the Victor Jr., which has kind of been the standard for single plane intakes for the small block Ford? So here's the funnel web. Funnel web is in red, and it did indeed make more peak power. It was up to 451 horsepower, and had we revved it farther, it looks like the gains would have been even more. But the funnel web only picked up on this application from 5,900 out past 6,500 compared to the Victor Jr., and it actually dropped below the Victor Jr. It made less power down low, which was odd. Normally when I run this funnel web, because it has kind of longer runners on it, it tends to do a little bit better than the Victor Jr., but on this combination, here's what happened. And it made less power from 5,100 and down below, and obviously quite a bit less than the dual plane. So on this application, even though we did pick up, a fair bit from the single plane stuff up at the top, especially with the funnel web compared to the RPM air gap,
it's hard to give up all that torque down low. I think maybe I would just, if I was going to the track where I wanted all this top end power, I might just, if we look at the previous test, maybe I would just put a an open or a 4-hole spacer on it, and then rev it out there and get a little bit of extra power at the top. So what do you guys think? Which one would you choose? The funnel web obviously is also harder to fit because it's such a high-rise deal, and on this application it did pick up some power, but is it enough to justify all of those things? Let's get to our conclusion.
Okay guys, what'd you think about our big intake shootout comparing the single plane to the dual plane to those awesome carb spacers? What do you guys think? Which one did you choose? All the extra torque offered by the dual plane? All that top end big rush power of the single plane? I'll tell you where I am. I want them both. Whenever I do this test, it always makes me mad. I see all that extra torque and I see all that extra peak power, and I want them both. Unfortunately, we can't have that unless somebody comes up with an adjustable intake. What about the spacers? I like the fact that the spacers improve the power output, especially that open spacer on the dual plane. Lots of extra power. I'd take it to the track, I'd put the spacer on, make my passes, and then take it off and go home. What do you guys think? What do you choose? I'm Richard Holder, guys. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. More testing coming up.